Welcome back to the Bible Lore Podcast, Episode 16, Empire. Sorry for the delay between episodes. We're planning a move and things are a little bit hectic right now. But for the next few episodes, I have an absolute treasure trove of scholars who I've interviewed or will be interviewing soon. And I'm also glad to announce a new mini-series that will help alleviate some of the workload of writing these absurdly long and detailed and researched scripts. We're doing The Bible at the Movies, which gives me an opportunity to talk about something else I really love, the dang pictures, and where I can bring along guests who aren't Bible scholars and might even be funny or whatever. I will bless them with good movies related to the Bible or torture them with bad ones, for I am a god of chaos. So that's all the housekeeping out of the way. Back to your regularly scheduled programming. Last time, I talked about the impressively long reign of Jeroboam II, but instead of recapping all of it myself, I'll quote from Finkelstein and Silberman's The Bible Unearthed, where the authors sum up Jeroboam's impact better than I ever could. Quote, "It is at the height of prosperity of the northern kingdom, under the rule of Jeroboam II, that we can finally identify the full complement of the criteria of statehood: literacy, bureaucratic administration, specialized economic production, and a professional army. It is also the period when we have the first record of prophetic protest. The oracles of the prophets Amos and Hosea are the earliest preserved prophetic books containing material that reflects the heyday of Jeroboam II. Their scathing denunciations of the corrupt and impious aristocracy of the north serve both to document the opulence of this era and to express for the first time ideas that would exert a profound effect on the crystallization of the Deuteronomistic ideology." End quote. And while the redaction of Hosea and Amos and their unique literary form make them difficult to specifically date, this is otherwise all spot on and gives us a serious origin point for biblical Israelite identity becoming a proper thing. We finally have a fully fledged Israelite state with all of the associated culture and contradictions that come with it. If Ahab's reign was distantly remembered as a time of untold splendor, 100 years later, Jeroboam's reign would truly fulfill this legend and create the kinds of records, writings, and infrastructure that would become mythical in time itself. But with his death, the kingdom of Israel would begin to falter, and its swift destruction would ensure Jeroboam's status not as an Augustus or a George Washington or some other monumental transitional figure, but instead as a king who flew just a bit too close to the sun. The beginning of this downfall would come at the hands of Assyria and their first bona fide emperor, Tiglath-Pileser III. Jeroboam died around 747 BCE, 2 years before old Tiggy Pills took the throne in Assyria. It's possible that all of this would have come crashing down anyway because of the massive shifts in Assyrian governance of the Middle East, but Samaria's own political struggles that predate this seem to have made their destruction inevitable. With the death of Jeroboam, his son Zechariah put on the crown. He made it just half a year before being killed in a conspiracy by his successor, Shallum. 2 Kings 15 portrays this as Shallum doing the actual killing himself. Quote, "Shallum hatched a plot against him and struck him down in the presence of the people and put him to death, and he became king in his stead." Now, whether this actually happened in that specific way or not is beyond our ability to recover, but what's more interesting is the place where he's said to have killed Zechariah. The translation I read places the location, quote, "in the presence of the people," but most scholars now translate it as a place name, Ibleam. Sorry for the pronunciation. I haven't mentioned this location before, but it's where Jehu is said to have killed Ahaziah, king of Judah, back in chapter 9. I noted in the episodes on Jehu that much of this story seemed unlikely. Ahaziah and Joram are described contemporarily as being killed by Hazael in battle, despite 2 Kings' insistence that Jehu himself ordered and carried out their killings with perfect bow shots. In the literary version, Ahaziah of Judah is killed at a location called Gur, which is said to be near Ibleam, a town in the north near Jezreel. And while it's possible that this mention of Ibleam in both coup stories is either a coincidence or, as Robert Alter contends, the verses are instead saying it was a public execution of a king, an interesting possibility is that this real conspiracy against Zechariah was given a literary echo in the Deuteronomists' more romantic telling of Ahaziah's death during Jehu's coup. We can often see real stories given mythical qualities through retrojection into the past, with different characters slotted in, and many expansions and embellishments added. The history becomes the legend, but not always set in its own time. Call it an Iron Age period piece mixed with fantasy, like how Game of Thrones has its basis in the very real War of the Roses from the 15th century. As humans, we love this kind of stuff. I know I do. And all the more when it's tied to cultural myth-making and a religio-political identity like the Bible is. Anyway, with the death of Zechariah, son of Jeroboam II, the prophecy of Jehu's dynasty that Elisha provided a few episodes back is complete. 4 generations pass, and we say goodbye to the Nimshides, ending at Ebleam, one of the places it started. So whoever his successor Shallum was, we can't really say because he's not even given the standard Deuteronomist evaluation. It doesn't say, and he did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. He did not depart from any of the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, that he caused Israel to sin. None of that, because Shallum is said to have reigned for a single month before being himself killed by a man named Menahem. So now we have our 4th king within the single year of 747, Menahem, son of Gadi. And this year of 4 kings makes me wonder whether there's something to the later criticisms of Jeroboam's administration. Was he so hated and his military expansion so disruptive that his death saw his opponents seizing the moment of weakness to topple the whole thing? It's hard to say, but the man who took power in this game of musical thrones, Menahem, is said to be more directly vicious, at least in explicit terms, than Jeroboam's expansionist reign. The king who won the 747 regnal lottery is said to have sacked a town called Tipsah, a city far north, way beyond even Jeroboam's kingdom. What's he doing up there? It's possibly a scribal fuck-up. A later scribe tried to fix this by correcting it to Tapua, a town a bit south of Nablus in the West Bank, and it's possible that this was what was originally meant, but this curious distant sacking apparently didn't bother many of those who transmitted the text, because that attempt to fix it and change it to Tapua comes from the turn of the eras, many hundreds of years after this text was written. But beyond this geographical oddity, Menahem is infamous for something far more horrifying, what he did at Tapua or Tipsah. He's said to have commanded a force of troops that ripped open the wombs of pregnant women of the towns they raided, wherever it was, with these soldiers tearing apart expectant mothers, a vicious accusation that gets thrown out a few other times in the Hebrew Bible. And this is a real practice carried out in genocidal campaigns throughout human history and across cultures. It's a serious accusation of brutality, and it's not at all implausible that it really happened. Menahem ruled for somewhere around 10 years, and it was viewed with extreme negativity by the author of Kings. But was this really him being a particularly wicked king, one who would even potentially tear apart pregnant Israelite women? Maybe. It's also possible that he's being hated because of what happened a few years into his reign. An Assyrian king came knocking at Samaria's door and walked away with a massive chunk of the kingdom's treasury, crippling the local economy. That king is referred to sometimes as Pul in the Bible, but more often in history by his regnal name, Tiglath-Pileser III. So let's rewind a bit and catch up on the history of the Assyrians during Jeroboam's reign. Last time I talked about how Assyria had seen both great economic development, but also significant political struggles, at least if we take the view of the high kings in the capital of Nineveh. They didn't have a tight grip over their claimed lands. But it apparently wasn't as decrepit as the late Holy Roman Empire. The king's subjects weren't enjoying the autonomy of, say, Canada as a commonwealth of the British Crown in modern times. Historian Eckart Frahm puts it this way, quote, "As far as we know, none of the magnates," that's what he calls the local governors, "not even the most ambitious ones, ever tried to become king. The Assyrian monarchs were weak, but they remained throughout this period the formal heads of the Assyrian state. There were rebellions, but they seem not to have undermined the legitimacy of the ruling dynasty. The man who led an insurrection in Ashur in 763 or 762 BCE was a member of the royal family. In fact, the role of officials such as Palil Eresh or Shamshi Alu resembles in many respects that of the Middle Assyrian Grand Viziers, who served as viceroys of the kingdom's western territories, a political arrangement from which the Assyrian state profited a great deal." End quote. And this is an important point to emphasize. While other scholars allow a bit more autonomy and note the destruction of the memory of folks like Nergal-Aresh following the 770s or so, there's almost a general Pax Assyria going on here, something more akin to the general federalism of the colonial era Americas, where de facto states could develop while remaining tacitly loyal to the High King, at least enough to ensure that there was no rebellion so long as the taxes weren't too high. On its face, this looks like something almost comparable to the Persian Empire or the Roman Empire, where locales, as long as they weren't rebellious and made sure to pay their taxes and tributes, retained relative autonomy. But the difference and the problem for the Assyrian crown was that these regional magnates had too much autonomy for their taste, and unlike the Romans, Persians, Spanish, and British crowns, the Assyrian king could not extract the kind of heavy tax burden that theoretically could make Nineveh's imperial core stand a head taller than the rest. As an example of the limits to Assyrian hegemony, in the latter half of Jeroboam II's reign, he cooperated closely with the local Assyrian governor, Shamshi-Ilu, who was mentioned just a few moments ago, paying tribute to him and joining in on military coalitions with him in exchange for maintaining Samaria's own relative independence. Independent at least relative to direct rule. Doubtless some of the wealth flowed back up to Nineveh and its nearby Calhu Palace town, but in the Assyrian dynasty's view, they were leaving money on the table. Why should Shamshi-Ilu be the one who gets all that money, rather than the crown? And while this lack of what they considered their rightful taxes and imperial tribute must have irked successive Assyrian kings Adad-nirari III, Shalmaneser IV, and Ashurdan III, each reigning alongside Jeroboam's insanely long reign between the 780s and 745, the crown apparently didn't have the willpower to constrain what some scholars refer to as the magnates who ruled over these portions of Assyria's political claims. For Tiglath-Pileser III, mere claims to power and control weren't enough. He wanted the real deal. Nobody quite knows what drove him to take what seems to me like a pretty good system and turn it into a machine of empire. Perhaps it was a boring quest for power, a raw ambition that rages in the hearts of some men. Perhaps it was the vision of wealth not quite making it to Nineveh. Perhaps it was the realization that Nineveh could reach extraordinary heights, a desire to see himself bathed in seas of gold. Perhaps it was the paranoia of the elite, that if I don't snatch power when I see an opportunity, someone else will. Of course, each motive, others that are more obscure, or a combination of them, can lie beneath human decisions at critical moments like these, which are always made within the context of social institutions that can have a bit of a life of their own. The militaristic Assyrian monarchy was pretty good at reproducing itself for the last few centuries, and maybe it was this kind of warring institution that made it more likely for someone like Tiglath-Pileser to come along. Regardless of his particular reasons, Tiglath-Pileser's decision did not differ from his predecessors like Hammurabi or Ramses II or several of the other kings we've covered in this show. He chose what many men have chosen both before and after his time, the path of conquest and extraction, the path of empire. Frahm discusses the definition of empire as a political center with outposts that has regional governors who report to the High King and collect taxes and tributes and so on and so on. He notes that some scholars don't consider Assyria an empire compared to Rome, and others don't consider Rome an empire when compared to, say, the British Empire. And we can argue semantics until we're blue in the face, but I think an element missing in Fromm's discussions, as well as those he's responding to, is technological possibility. It was far more possible with the transportation technology and infrastructure of each empire's period to control larger and larger swaths of land as things progressed. And each time a militaristic state has preyed upon that ability. They shift in geographic centers of power, in modes of material production, and in technology that enables this expansion, but these have, in the aggregate, become more sophisticated and capable of broadening their horizons over time. The Assyrians had access to relatively new iron technology, and their aforementioned canal system allowed increased protection against drought. The Romans had a seafaring capital and impressive abilities to control Mediterranean trade routes in a way that would have been foreign to Nineveh. The British, many years later, had guns and sophisticated ships and navigation technology, as well as the economic development of capitalist enterprises that allowed a brutal efficiency in their control over and extraction of resources from the far corners of the earth. And so the possibility of larger empires has allowed later states to go far beyond the boundaries of Nineveh and Rome and even the city of London in its heyday. I mean, if you went and sampled 30 Americans walking down Main Street, how many of them would even know what the IMF and World Bank are? And yet these sophisticated tools of empire make Rome look like a moderately sized city in comparison. But that lack of sophistication doesn't make Rome less of an empire. In our case, we're dealing with a far less complex form of hegemony than even Rome, one that hardly has anything recognizable as a legal contract. And so, of course, it won't look like modern day empires. Instead, it looks like what it is: a bit less Byzantine than Rome, but still operating on the same economic and political logic, one of domination and extraction from the hinterlands and into its core in Nineveh. And Tiglath-Pileser III achieved this centralization by doing a giant reform of the way the government functioned both in Nineveh and at its reaches, the kind of thing that today would require a constitutional convention in most nations, but that Tiglath-Pileser apparently had the political willpower to put into action. Amanda Podany puts it like this, quote, Tiglath-Pileser reformed and restructured the Assyrian government so that he could not just reconquer the empire, he could hold on to it. His reform successfully gave the empire new life. It was to last for over 120 more years. Tiglath-Pileser III replaced all those almost independent governors by appointees of his own choosing, beholden to him for their power. He divided up big provinces so that the new governors controlled less territory and had less power than their predecessors. He split high official positions so that each man had half the responsibilities and authority of someone who had held that position in the past. He chose eunuchs for many government and military jobs. These men had no sons, no one who could inherit their position. He created a network of spies traveling through the empire who would inform him of any treachery and any possible rebellions before they broke out. End quote. And so these reforms created imperial infrastructure which allowed less autonomy from the sticks and demanded more communication control centered on Nineveh. The reaches of this network of bureaucrats and spies and officials were fairly significant, probably about as far as one could stretch with the landlocked Nineveh as its center. So I'll call it an empire. At the same time, what seems to have happened is a bit unique as empires go. Roman emperors, as far as I know, rarely had to seize authority over their foreign lands with such an iron fist and a widespread reform. The empire inherited most of their land from the Republic, which had slowly gained it through conquest. Same thing with the British Empire. Outside of oddities like Rhodesia, most governors of their colonies were loyal to the crown for the entire duration, and they built the empire bit by bit, albeit under the emerging logic of capitalism. Putting down rebellions, conquering countries, sure, but a weakened imperial office reversing course and grasping power with this kind of success at this scale? It's like if the Holy Roman Empire had some figure who showed up in the 1700s and managed to centralize all authority and form it into the empire it had been many centuries earlier. It's just plain weird. I'm all ears. Let me know if there's been some other precedent, someone else in world history who's pulled this off, but it seems pretty singular. Maybe this is just something that's not possible with these larger empires, but we're starting from a relatively small scale. It's been theorized that Tiglath-Pileser managed this reform in part because of the state of disorganization and disaster that had plagued Assyria in the decades after Shalmaneser III's death. One of the factors that had helped the recovery of the post-Bronze Age collapsed Middle East was a milder climate with decent rainfall. The collapse itself had been caused in part by an arid spell in the 14th and 13th centuries, which had destabilized much of the surrounding region, but in the centuries that followed, Mesopotamia had enjoyed a far more moderate climate and stable agriculture. By the mid-700s, however, that golden weather had given way to the more common steppe climate that most people associate with the Middle East today. With rainfall not as guaranteed, it took serious agricultural engineering to ensure canals and irrigation were ordered enough to sustain the farmland. That takes organization and bureaucracy and cooperation, as well as roads to facilitate communication, the kind of thing that may have faltered under decentralized rule of competing local governors. Roads especially were a big part of Tiglath-Pileser's focus. His governors were kept on a short leash and threatened with pain of death to keep the roads in good condition to allow mules to travel all across the region without delay. The spies, bureaucrats, the communication, none of that works without these roads. But there were massive setbacks in the first decade of his rule. Some kind of epidemic, the specifics of which are unrecoverable, swept through the land and began devastating city centers especially, where lifespans were already typically shorter due to crowded and unsanitary living conditions. Even if they didn't have germ theory as such, they knew these kinds of diseases spread through close contact. Lockdowns were implemented to limit the spread, which created backlash and revolts that required rapid response to pacify, the Iron Age equivalent of people who threw a fit because they were asked to wear a mask to the grocery store. It's likely that this kind of chaos helped to justify the need for a powerful central government, headed by Tiglath-Pileser and his close allies and family members, who he put in charge of most functions of state. Through this management, the Assyrian king consolidated his empire and set up a system that would outlast him by a century. By the time most folks probably realized that all of this power had been claimed by the king, the feat had already been accomplished, at least within the center of Assyria. The outer reaches, as we'll see, sometimes required a bit more direct intervention to get the picture. And with this true empire came material extraction in the form of taxes, works projects, and tribute. Podany's book has a wonderful section that covers how this imperial reach allowed for serious building projects, but also surviving documentation of how those building projects were actually achieved. There are artistic depictions of labor forces in rock quarries, mining for the materials that would become, for example, the Lamassu reliefs that serve as the artistic basis for the Bible Lore podcast logo. It started with slaves, laborers, and artisans at these quarries with instructions from the king for the statues and artwork that would be transported to the palace. These workers would carve out the rough shape of the Lamassu from alabaster, and as work went on, they would communicate with the palace through cuneiform letters, some of which have survived, providing status updates on how the work was going. Once the Lamassu was in the general shape that the detailing artists in the palace needed, the giant mass of stone would be loaded up using ropes and carts and a whole lot of sweating men pushing and pulling it onto a raft on the Tigris River. Many would have died of exhaustion in the brutal sun, replaced with fresh laborers from the underclasses and the deportation regime of the king's wars. More on that in a minute. While we know at least one of these ships destined for the palace sank in the Euphrates, most of them made it to their destination in good time, and the relief sculptures would be set up in their final resting places, where sculptors and detailers would set to work on turning them from a vague shape into intricate works of art. In the Imperial Archives, Podany even notes a complaint from a lead artist whose co-workers disagreed on the portrayal of the king in a large sculpture, prompting the supervisor to escalate the problem to the king. Quote, Nabu Ashered sent some sketches and models to the king and wrote to him about them. We have now sent 2 royal images to the king. I myself sketched the royal image which is in outline. They fashioned the royal image which is in the round. The king should examine them, and whichever the king finds acceptable, we will execute accordingly. Now he came to his particular concerns. Let the king pay attention to the hands, the chin, and the hair. Nabu Ashered alerted the king about the disagreements among the artists regarding how the king's arm and scepter should be portrayed. He not too subtly campaigned for his own design and for some royal support. As for the royal image which they are making, the scepter is lying across his arm, and his arm is resting on his thighs. I myself do not agree with this, and I will not fashion it so. I could speak with them about features, about anything whatsoever, but they wouldn't listen to me. End quote. And while unlike a unique portrait of the king, many of the chimeric Lamassu reliefs and sculptures were done in fairly standardized styles, the artists undoubtedly would have regularly checked in with the king and his advisors to ensure everything was being done to his satisfaction. While typically displayed in modern times in the stone's naturally sandy gray color like Roman sculptures and reliefs, these Lamassu would have been intricately painted as well to bring them to life. Unfortunately, many of these sculptures at Nineveh were destroyed by ISIS as part of their fundamentalist crusade in the fallout of the American invasion and destabilization of Iraq and Syria, yet another casualty of imperial ambitions in our modern time. But it wasn't just the impressive, if terrifying, Lamassu sculptures and other artistic endeavors that this imperial infrastructure facilitated. It was also a level of comfort for the wealthy that beggars belief sometimes. These sons of bitches had ice in the middle of Syria before modern refrigeration. It was shipped from the northern mountains in what is now Armenia down to the south, and it allowed an impressive amount of food storage and even some luxuries. Eventually, large and impressive circular ice houses would be built that helped insulate the ice further and keep it frozen throughout much of the year. By the middle of the millennium, we start getting depictions of goddamn fruit sorbet. If you were lucky enough to live near an ice house, there's a chance you might have even been able to enjoy an ice-cold beer 2,500 years before we figured out how to make mechanical heat pumps filled with HFCs. But it wasn't all beers as cold as the Rockies back in the Levant. If ancient Israel's political turmoils near the start of Tiglath-Pileser's reign seemed rough, the tribute paid to this new and terrifying regime would have felt like a point of true panic, one that would not be unwarranted. They'd weathered a year of 4 kings and 2 coups, and just as things started to feel a bit stable under Menachem's rule, an efficient and brutal new Assyrian king had shown up on their doorstep and walked away with a huge amount of the capital's treasury. Imperial control, to an extent probably not seen since the Bronze Age collapse, had arrived back in the Levant. Menachem died around the year 738. He ruled probably around 9 or 10 years. If he really did kill all those pregnant women, he's a piece of shit, though one could hardly fault him for paying off Tiglath-Pileser. That's all I've got for Menachem, a king who took charge in a time of chaos, but who couldn't really right the ship in these turbulent waters, as we're about to see. His son Pekahiah took over and ruled for 2 years, before being killed in a coup, once again, enacted by the similarly named Pekah, one of his own military commanders. Captain Pekah killed Pekahiah. Sure, why not? Pekah is said to have ruled for 20 years, but that's not possible at all because, well, there's not that much time left in the history of the Kingdom of Israel, and Pekah is not even the last king. This, as much as anything, demonstrates that while there are a fair few alignments between the historical record and the Book of Kings, we still cannot just give the book the benefit of the doubt. Pekah, whoever he was, seems to have seen his ascension as the opportunity not only to become a Menachem-type king, but also to go beyond his predecessors and fully incorporate Judah into his kingdom. While previous kings had chosen to install puppet rulers on the throne of Jerusalem or stick with general vassalage, Pekah is said to have teamed up with Rezin of Damascus for a full invasion of the south. The Judahite king Ahaz, staring down the barrel of a regional coalition, called on Tiglath-Pileser for assistance. This kind of distant squabble could be both a nuisance to the central crown, but also an opportunity to justify a deep incursion toward the Egyptian border. See, they're calling for us. Please, Tiglath-Pileser, my kingdom longs for freedom. And hey, it was on the buffer zone close to the Egyptian border. Not a bad idea to institute a bit more control. Nineveh's decision was, therefore, a no-brainer. In response to this local dispute, the emperor met Pekah with a demand for more tribute. Pekah refused, and it nearly spelled the end of Samaria as a political capital. Tiglath-Pileser met Pekah's forces with his own, and after defeating the Israelites handily in battle, he brought in the force of the Assyrian deportation machine, which we should talk about a bit more, as I've hinted at it quite a bit in the show so far. The Assyrian reforms had given Tiglath-Pileser the ability to massively scale up the resettlement programs of older kingdoms. The emperor's new standing armies and well-kept royal roads and networks of bureaucrats and spies allowed the administration to freely relocate people at an astonishing rate. Thousands of subjects from Samaria's realm are said to have been carried off to Assyria. It seems to have often been the influential, the elite, the artisans who were specifically targeted, people whose economic specializations or political influence were either useful or threatening to the Assyrians. These folks and their families and belongings were loaded onto mules and carts and marched out of their homeland. Recorded in 2 Kings 15 are people from, quote, Ijon, Abel Beth Maacah, Genoa, Kadesh, Hatzor, Gilead, and Galilee, all the land of Naphtali, end quote. How many people were contained in this first round is hard to pinpoint, but it was likely in the thousands, the first Israelites in the midst of the Assyrian resettlement program that would, from the regions all around the empire, result in between 2 and 4 million people being displaced. There are records of supply requests on these forced marches into new lands, though none specifically of this Israelite relocation. Because of this, some scholars have sought to distance these from proper death marches, which is probably a fair qualifier. But it's still a form of forced resettlement, and even if it was the world's most polite resettlement, one that was utilitarian in its aims, it's still a form of imperial control through what could be called ethnic cleansing, or, if we're being far more charitable than is even reasonable, ethnic stratification, divide and conquer if we're going to use a very cliched term. Interestingly, the deportation regime of the Assyrians was not terribly focused on cultural assimilation. These people would have been allowed to bring their gods and their belongings and their families, and as much as they could carry. They were settled hundreds of miles to the northeast in the case of the Israelites, and many of these settlements seem to have retained some of their distinctive culture, even as they adapted to their new settings. Now, again, this is not to downplay the seriousness of this imperial relocation. They wanted successful towns that developed things economically for Assyria, sure, but this was undoubtedly a traumatic event, and certainly some people died in these forced marches. I mean, even the Trail of Tears wasn't always a starvation march. They had supplies, and American relocation was done with the promises of land and the ability to retain the Native Americans' own culture. Only the most arch-reactionary would defend these kinds of culture-defining upheavals, and so however kind the Assyrians portrayed themselves in doing this, it was a scarring and devastating experience to those who were being deported. But this was not a full emptying of Samaria and Israel. It was targeted and aimed at limiting the petty kingdom's rule and ability. Seemingly sensing that the battle against Assyria was hopeless, the Book of Kings claims that Hoshea, one of Pekah's high-ranking advisors, assassinated the king and offered terms to Tiglath-Pileser. Just as he had ousted his own predecessor in a coup, so it goes with Pekah.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme. Every stanza kind of rhymes with the last one.
Samaria would lose territory and many people, but it would retain the tacit right to operate as a subject kingdom of Assyria under presumably more direct control and a higher tax burden under King Hoshea, who seems to have taken the throne with Tiglath-Pileser's blessing somewhere around 732 BCE. Perhaps there was an understanding between the Assyrian and Israelite kings, but if they'd worked out some kind of arrangement, it seems to have soured after the Assyrian king's death in 727. Tiglath-Pileser, by the end of his reign, had not only reformed Assyria into something more manageable by the central government, he'd also expanded the claims to encompass essentially all of the Levant and all of the Fertile Crescent, spanning from the northern reaches of the Dead Sea up through Lebanon, though not taking the Phoenician coast. And then on the eastern side, he'd asserted control over Babylon in the south and a fair bit beyond towards the Gulf. He'd created a professional standing army, ensuring that behind the push for conscription was an already geared and trained force which served as a not-so-subtle enticement. He reigned from 745 to 727, but despite not quite hitting even 2 decades, his regime was nothing if not transformative and truly terrifying. Tiglath-Pileser's son, Shalmaneser V, took over, and the increased control and continuing momentum of Assyria would see even the supposed puppet king Hoshea backed into the same corner his predecessor Pekah had rebelled against. And next time, when Hoshea rebels against Assyria like Pekah, there will be no puppet ruler installed. It will spell the end, instead, of the kingdom of Israel. So there we have it. Ice-cold beers, imperialism, deportation, pandemics, climate change. I'm not trying to draw parallels to our modern period, but they are impossible to ignore. So crack open a cold one while you wait for the next episode of the Bible Lore Podcast.